Good morning. The hearing will officially come to order, though you have all unofficially already come to order. We welcome you here today. Thanks so much. We have a terrific panel here today, and we're very grateful to have you and to be able to take a moment to reflect on one of the longest and most complex and sometimes frustrating challenges that we have, all of us, faced over the years. Today we will take a moment to talk about where we are in the effort to revive the Middle East peace process. Yesterday, as I think most know, certainly all those who follow these matters, in Cairo, the Arab League endorsed Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas's entry into U.S.-mediated indirect talks with Israel. With negotiations likely to resume soon, we're really reaching a critical juncture. And after meetings just this past weekend that I engaged in with Israeli and Palestinian leaders in Jordan and in the West Bank and in Israel, I personally am confident that this really is a moment of opportunity. Of course, we're all well aware that we've had those moments before. I remember standing on the White House lawn when a great handshake took place, and we had a sense of great optimism, and a president visited Gaza at the airport opening and so forth. We've been down this road, and we're all well aware of the obstacles. There is a profound trust deficit between Israelis and Palestinians, deep divisions between Palestinian factions in Gaza and the West Bank, and perhaps even to some degree with some leadership ensconced in Damascus. An Israeli coalition government that initially retreated from prior peace initiatives, and a profound frustration in the region with the lack of progress since the president's Cairo speech raised expectations and new hopes. While some are deeply skeptical, I do continue to believe that to a greater extent than many realize, the conditions are in place for significant progress, but only if all sides can summon the leadership, the commitment, and the courage necessary to make lasting peace possible. One thing I might just comment, I spoke at the Doha conference on Islam in the West a few weeks ago, and in conversations that I had with different people, including the Emir of Qatar and the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, same person, increasingly from the people that I talk to, there is a growing sort of realization and awareness of the few tracks that really can work. There's sort of a unanimity out there, if you will, among many different parties who don't often talk to each other and for political reasons can't get together, but all of whom kind of have a good sense of the end game. And the bigger question is not, what's it look like? It's more sort of how do you get there? And these various restraints stand in the way of it. The fact is, most Israelis and Palestinians still recognize that a two-state solution remains the only workable solution and the only just solution. The demographics in Israel simply demand a two-state solution if Israel is to remain a Jewish democracy. Israelis are troubled by what they see as growing efforts to delegitimize Israel around the world. And while many Israelis are understandably gravely concerned about the existential threat posed by Iran and the danger of a rearmed Hezbollah and Hamas, nothing will do more to undermine extremists and rejectionists than progress, real progress, towards peace with the Palestinians. I have heard in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in the Sudan, in other parts of the world, the constant drumbeat of the way the Palestinians are treated, or vice versa, Israel-Palestine relations. It is a recruitment tool. It is an albatross around all necks in so many ways, and it needs to be resolved. In President Abbas and Prime Minister Fayyad, I'm convinced we have genuine partners for peace. And the Israelis seem to recognize this as well now. They've made unprecedented strides in the West Bank toward building a future Palestinian state from the ground up by increasing security capacity, fighting corruption, building institutions that can govern effectively. And if you talk to General Dayton or others, there's clear proof that at times of great stress, i.e. during Gaza and the war, the West Bank stayed quiet, and large credit is given to the development of the security forces and that having happened. But we have to show progress now in the peace process to capitalize on Hamas's weakness at this particular moment and to build greater credibility with the Palestinian people. Ultimately, we all know it is the Israelis and the Palestinians who must reach agreement. But America has a vital role to play as an energetic and effective broker, ensuring that both sides make good faith proposals that bring the parties closer to peace. And at the right moment, we will have a role to play in bridging any gaps between the respective positions. Personally, I suspect that progress will likely come first on the combination of borders and security. And the reason is that they're closely integrated. Israelis cannot and will not accept a repeat of what happened when they withdrew from Lebanon and Gaza, and nor should they be expected to. And it is entirely anticipatable and expected and appropriate that the Prime Minister of their country, of Israel, should have a concern about security and needs that concern met. By the same token, as you resolve the issue of borders and you begin to build the security structure, you begin to give confidence on both sides about those issues. Focusing on borders and security initially, in my judgment, resolves the issue of West Bank settlements and lays the groundwork for reaching agreement on the other issues. While a final agreement may seem far off, remember, it was not so long ago that Israelis and Palestinians came closer than ever to a comprehensive peace at Taba. And the Clinton parameters included tough sacrifices on both sides as part of a compromise that was fair to all. A contiguous Palestinian state based on 1967 borders with land swaps, security guarantees for Israel, a capital for both states in Jerusalem, a significant compensation for refugees with a right of return to Palestine and any resettlement in Israel subject to negotiation. That was the framework, and they came this close. I remember having a lunch in Ramallah with Chairman Arafat, which he said to me very directly and boldly that he regretted that he hadn't taken advantage of Taba. In 2002, the Arab Peace Initiative, endorsed by every Arab country, provided another key piece of the final puzzle. The promise for Israel that a comprehensive peace agreement would bring normalized relations with the Arab world. A regional shift, more plausible at a moment when Israelis and Arab governments share profound concerns about Iran. And you need to focus on that. There's just a sea change in the discussions when you go over there. The first words out of the mouths of most of the leaders I met with in the region and have over the last years is not Israel. It's Iran. I still believe the Clinton parameters and the Arab Peace Initiative provide the only realistic basis, I emphasize, with obviously changes to reflect where we are today, but the basis for lasting peace and security. And I am confident that deep down, most of the Israeli and Palestinian people understand that as well. America's role is vital, but we must all be partners in this effort. Prime Minister Fayyad has laid out a detailed plan for strengthening Palestinian institutions. And that effort, frankly, needs much greater support from the Arab world and from the West. I will never forget being in Ramallah the day he was elected, and I was the first person to meet with him in 2005, and he looked at me and he said, "Senator, I know exactly what you expect of me," meaning the United States. "We need to disarm Hamas. Now you tell me how I'm supposed to do that. I have no radios, no police, no cars, no capacity. Hamas can deliver services on any given day more easily than we can." And we were just absent for the next 4.5 years, literally. So we all must encourage the Palestinians in this peace effort, and that's why the Arab League decision was really so significant. And I congratulate the administration, those involved in their efforts to help to bring about the kind of cohesion that was exhibited in that. I was particularly pleased to hear the Syrian Foreign Minister, Walid Muallim, praise President Abbas's decision to enter proximity talks. Finally, even as we move ahead with negotiations and building capacity in the West Bank, we must address the dire conditions in Gaza. 1 year ago, I personally saw firsthand the devastation there. And it's a great disappointment that so little has been rebuilt since then. In southern Israel, I also saw the toll that Hamas rockets had inflicted in a barrage that no country should or could endure interminably. I recognize the importance of Gilad Shalit to the Israeli people, but our grievance and theirs is not with the people of Gaza. And based on my recent visit and discussions with all the parties, I believe there is a way to work with international organizations to get more construction material into Gaza in a way that empowers the Palestinian Authority and not Hamas. And that will help significantly my judgment in the peace process. We have a terrific panel today to bring a range of perspectives. Daniel Kurtzer is the former United States ambassador to Israel and Egypt. Rob Malley directs the Middle East North Africa program at the International Crisis Group. Ziad Asali is president of the American Task Force on Palestine. And David Makovsky is director of the Project of the Middle East Peace Process at the Washington Institute of Near East Policy. So we look forward to a frank and insightful conversation. I will have to step out for a couple of phone calls during this. I ask your indulgence for that during the process. And we also ask, if you could, to limit your prepared comments. We'll put your full testimony in the record as if read in full. But if you could summarize this in 5 minutes, then members would have a little more opportunity to be able to have a dialogue. Thank you very much, Senator Lugar.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Kerry, for convening this hearing, and I join you in welcoming our distinguished witnesses. The United States continues to support a negotiated Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement that would address Israel's security concerns and satisfy Palestinian aspirations for statehood while resolving the full range of final status issues. And I have welcomed the administration's efforts toward this end. On his second day in office, President Obama appointed our former colleague, Senator George Mitchell, as special envoy for Middle East peace. I was pleased that Senator Mitchell was able to meet with members of the committee a few weeks ago to share his perspectives. The task before Senator Mitchell is daunting. Peace talks were suspended in the aftermath of the fighting in Gaza. The parties have been in an impasse over the demand for a settlement freeze. Rhetoric on both sides remains incendiary. And whether through proximity talks or some other mechanism, we are searching for a way to move forward. The question is what can be done to build confidence and increase the likelihood of success. New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman suggested in an editorial last November that the United States' approach to the Middle East peace process had reached a point of inertia that is contributing to bad behavior by the parties. And he proposed a dramatic shift in strategy, saying the United States should end our participation in the peace process, publicly informing the parties that we will come back when they get serious. Friedman argues that by continuing active U.S. mediation efforts, regardless of the behavior of both sides, and I quote, we relieve all the political pain from the Arab and Israeli decision makers by creating the impression in the minds of their publics that something serious is happening, end of quote. This allows Israeli and Palestinian leaders to associate themselves with the peace process without making any political sacrifices or tempering their ideological agendas. I would not want to take the ball out of Senator Mitchell's hands at this point, but I share Tom Friedman's frustrations and believe we should be thinking beyond conventional mediation strategies. I'd be interested to hear our witnesses' views on the likely impact of the move suggested by Tom Friedman. Meanwhile, Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Salam Fayyad has been working quietly to build governing institutions for the day when a Palestinian state is established. General Dayton, the U.S. Security Coordinator, and his international team have been helping to build the capacity of the Palestinian security forces and the Interior Ministry. Substantial progress has been made, and the program merits continued support. Other ministries are making headway and becoming more accountable and transparent, but there is a limit to how much progress can be made absent results on the diplomatic front. The administration has not limited its ambitions to the Palestinian track. It has articulated a vision for a comprehensive Middle East peace. And I would appreciate hearing from our witnesses today about how we can best capitalize on regional dynamics to advance this goal. To what extent has the common threat of a nuclear Iran-influenced calculations on the part of key regional actors? The administration has made overtures to Syria in recent weeks, including a visit to Damascus by Undersecretary William Burns and the nomination of a U.S. ambassador to Syria following a long hiatus. Nevertheless, the joint press conference last week by the presidents of Iran and Syria produced provocative anti-American statements. What are the prospects in the coming few years for a meaningful advancement of the United States-Syrian dialogue or of Israeli-Syrian peace talks? I look forward to hearing the assessments of our witnesses regarding the situation on the ground in the Middle East and their prescriptions for making progress toward the goal of comprehensive peace. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Lugar. Mr. Ambassador, if you would begin first, and we'll run down the table, we appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the committee. I want to thank you, first of all, for the invitation to appear here today and to use this opportunity also to thank you for the support that you gave me during the years that I served as our ambassador in Egypt and Israel. It was really quite remarkable that we were able to actually accomplish something during those years with the cooperation of the Senate and what we did in the field. Mr. Chairman, in some respects, I could end my statement now by simply saying that I agree with everything that you and Senator Lugar said in introducing this subject. But you asked us to address the question of ground truths and the challenges ahead, and I want to dig a little deeper, perhaps, in looking at both sides of those questions. First of all, I think it's quite imperative to remind all of us that the pursuit of peace in the Middle East is not a favor that we do for the parties in the region, but is an imperative of our national interests. We benefit both immediately from the process of peacemaking, and of course we would benefit from the success of peacemaking. And this also touches on Senator Lugar's point, which is to the extent that we are seen as conducting a strong policy in pursuit of peace in the Middle East, it helps us build alliances and conduct our diplomacy much more strongly with respect to the threats we face in the region, including Iran. With respect to ground truths, there's no question that the situation on the ground today is challenging, and as was indicated in the opening statements, this results from ongoing settlement activity, ongoing infrastructure of terrorism that exists, and incitement. There is a right-wing coalition in Israel which presents its own problems with respect to developing its policies in favor of peace, and Palestinian governance is divided very badly, both politically and geographically. But frankly, this is no more challenging an environment than we have faced in the past. And resolute, bold, creative, determined, persistent American diplomacy has succeeded in dealing with similar challenges in the past. The Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, the Madrid Peace Conference, were not achieved in perfect environments for peacemaking, but it required the kind of leadership that our leaders are capable of and the kind of strong diplomacy of which we are capable to try to translate potential opportunities into successes. In this respect, the ground truth is actually not as bad as some analysts would try to convince us. Violence is down. The Israeli Security Agency, the Shabak, indicated that 2009 was one of the best years in recent memory with respect to violence conducted by Palestinians against Israel. The West Bank economy is in good shape and it's growing. Public opinion polls on both sides indicate consistent support for peace and consistent support for a two-state solution. So it's not just that determined leadership can overcome challenges, it's also that the situation on the ground is potentially conducive to exploiting opportunities for peacemaking. What's needed then is a U.S. policy and a U.S. strategy. And I must say, as much as I hope for the success of what the administration is doing these days, I have been disappointed this past year with the lack of boldness and the lack of creativity and the lack of strength in our diplomacy with respect to this peace process. We have not articulated a policy, and we don't have a strategy. We pursued a settlements freeze, and then we backed away from a settlements freeze. We pursued confidence-building measures on the part of some Arabs, and we backed away from confidence-building measures. And in neither case were these initiatives seen within a context of a larger strategy of peacemaking. I would suggest, therefore, that we also re-examine this question of proximity talks. As much as I hope for their success, the very fact that we are conducting proximity talks these days, or thinking about conducting proximity talks, is a throwback to what we did 20 years ago. Palestinians and Israelis have negotiated face-to-face in direct talks for 20 years, and it's not understandable why we would now have them sit in separate rooms and move between them. If we had strong terms of reference, perhaps we would need to conduct proximity talks, but there is so far no suggestion that the terms of reference for these proximity talks are strong enough to warrant the absence of face-to-face negotiations. Therefore, let me spend 2 minutes on what I think needs to be done, the challenges ahead. First of all, I think it's time, after 43 years from the 1967 war, that the United States articulated our own views on the way this conflict should end. I'm not suggesting a U.S. plan, and I certainly am not suggesting that we try to impose a settlement. A settlement must emerge from negotiations between the two sides. But we have views about how this conflict should end. We have views about territory, about Jerusalem, about settlements, about refugees, about security, about cooperation between the two sides with respect to economic and other matters. And it is really quite surprising that we are hesitant to express our views and let the sides in the Middle East understand where the United States is coming from. As we do so, we also need a strategy which I would suggest needs to be multi-pronged, not simply getting to negotiations, but rather getting to negotiations on the basis of strong U.S. parameters so that the parties don't start from scratch, but rather pick up from where they left off. They accomplished a great deal, as Senator Kerry suggested, at Taba. They also accomplished a great deal between President Abbas and Prime Minister Olmert in 2008. And we should try to capture that progress in establishing parameters within which the parties should negotiate. If they choose to start with a negotiation on borders, which I support, then we need to articulate principles so that the parties don't wander into areas that are not going to be productive. We should also build regional and international support structures, including better use of the Arab Peace Initiative. We should revive the multilateral negotiations so as to bring again the strength of Arab support for peacemaking. We should continue to advocate for a settlements freeze and for action by the Palestinian Authority against incitement and against terrorist infrastructure. In other words, between having a vision and having a strategy, the United States will be back in the diplomatic game, something where we have been absent for too many years. Finally, I would suggest there are two contextual issues which need to be addressed. One question has been raised as to whether or not we should open up a dialogue with Hamas at this time. I think we should not. I have seen no indication on the part of Hamas that it's changed its policies or its practices, and therefore it does not meet any of the conditions that are proper for the United States to engage in dialogue. And secondly, I think the humanitarian situation in Gaza, as Senator Kerry and Senator Lugar suggested, needs to be addressed immediately. There is no excuse for having 1.5 million people suffer as a result of a failure of peacemaking. and we can find ways for the international community to deliver assistance in a manner that protects both Israeli and Egyptian security. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very helpful, and obviously raises some questions. We'll come back. Dr. Malley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me. In the 17 years since the peace process began in earnest at Oslo, there have been better times, and, as Ambassador Kurtzer said, there have been many worse times. I can't recall a time that was more complex, contradictory, and confusing. And the reason for that, I think, is that since the last time that we were engaged in a genuine effort, a real diplomatic effort to achieve comprehensive peace in 2000, at the time of the Clinton parameters and of Taba, since that time, the ground beneath the peace process has changed and been transformed in radical ways. First of all, U.S. credibility, unfortunately, has decreased and diminished, and anyone who travels in the region hears that every day. Second, the entities, Palestinian and Israeli, have changed and have fragmented since the time that we were last involved in the year 2000. Faith in the peace process on both sides. There may be support for a two-state settlement, but belief in a two-state settlement and even interest in plans is waning in both Israel and on the Palestinian side. And finally, on the regional, in the regional landscape, we're seeing polarization, fragmentation between different camps, which is making it much harder to achieve a consensus on how to move forward. Now, U.S. efforts, and I agree with everything, Mr. Chairman, you said, and Senator Lugar, and Ambassador Kurtzer, U.S. efforts need to be pursued, but they have to adjust to these changing realities, and so far, unfortunately, they haven't fully done so. Now, you've entitled the hearing Ground Truths and Challenges Ahead, and I think that's the absolutely befitting title, because what we need to do is take a sober look at what the ground truths are today, what are these changes that have occurred over the last decade, and see how we adapt to them to overcome the challenges. And that's what I'd like to do now, just mention four areas in which I believe the situation has changed and how we need to adapt. The first is waning U.S. credibility. Now, we need to devise a policy that takes that into account and tries to restore our credibility. I think Ambassador Kurtzer just mentioned that what we need is a strategy that has a clear vision of what we want to accomplish, a realistic way of accomplishing it, and a strategy to deal with failure in the event failure were to occur. That wasn't the case so far in the instance of the settlements policy, which serves as sort of a counterexample of what we ought to be doing. But now if we're moving towards final status talks, then we need at some point, as a number have already suggested, to put ideas on the table, but do it at a time when we actually think we could back them up, do it with international support, and do it in a way that will resonate both with the Israeli and Palestinian publics. Senator Lugar, you asked about Tom Friedman's suggestion. My answer would be that certainly I wouldn't endorse it now, but if the U.S. were to put on the table clear principles for final status agreement, not an imposed solution, but just parameters, and one or both parties were to say no, it might then be time to reconsider our approach and tell them, or whichever party said no, that they have to reconsider their own position. Secondly, we need a policy that's going to take into account the changed political outlooks on both sides, what I call the dramatic loss of faith in the two-state settlement. It's not a personal issue. When President Abbas says he doesn't want to engage in direct negotiations, we may lament it. But this is the cry of the last true believer on the Palestinian side in negotiations. He is not expressing a personal view. What he's doing is, after long years of being a true believer, expressing a much more deeply held belief by the vast majority of Palestinians that talks at this point would be for naught. He is the most moderate expression of that deeply held and deeply entrenched collective disillusionment. Likewise, on the Israeli side, when Prime Minister Netanyahu calls for a Palestinian recognition of a Jewish state, or when he calls for much more stringent security measures than had been in place, than had been contemplated even in Taba or Camp David, these may be his personal thoughts, but they go well beyond. They express deep disillusionment on the part of the Israeli public, and the need that the Israeli public have today to believe that the Arabs truly recognize their right to exist as a Jewish state, and for security measures that will deal with this kind of unconventional threats that emerge in Gaza and South Lebanon. So let's understand what we're dealing with, that these are deeply held popular views. The third adaptation we need is to adapt to the growing fragmentation in both Israel and Palestine, and the fact that dynamic groups have emerged that we are not really equipped to deal with. And in fact, the peace process today is doing the least and matters the least to those who can do the most to disrupt it. I'm talking about settlers and the religious right in Israel, and I'm talking about Islamists, the diaspora and refugees on the side of the Palestinians. We need a process that reaches out to them and then that tries to address some of their concerns. Ambassador Kurtzer mentioned the question of Hamas. I'm not going to advocate engagement with Hamas. The time is not ripe. I'm not even saying that the U.S. at this point should openly promote Palestinian reconciliation. But I would ask a simple question. Do we truly believe that a Palestinian national movement, as divided, fragmented, and unwieldy as it is today, is in a position to sign a historic agreement, to implement it, and to sell it to its people? I believe not. And so I think we need a policy that at least does not object to efforts by Palestinians to come together. Fourth and lastly, we need a policy that reflects and adapts to the changed regional landscape. Today, the Palestinians cannot make peace on their own. It's not clear whether they could have in the year 2000. Today, they're too weak, they're too fragmented, and too subject to foreign interference to do so. That brings me directly to the question of Syria. If we want to have peace between Israelis and Palestinians, I believe today moving towards peace between Israelis and Syrians is not an obstacle, it's a precondition. Bringing Syria in would do three things. First, it would provide cover to the Palestinians, and they need it. Second, it would provide a real incentive to Israelis who would know that if they reach peace with Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese, they would get full recognition and normalcy with all Arab states, which is the real incentive, much more than a piece of paper they would sign with the Palestinians. And thirdly, if the Syrians were engaged and involved, and if progress was made towards peace, other actors in the region, Hamas, Hezbollah, and perhaps even Iran, would have to read the writing on the wall and adjust their own behavior. So far, the engagement with the Syrians has produced mixed results, as both sides see it. Both sides are disappointed. But we shouldn't have the unrealistic expectation that Syria would break with Hamas, Hezbollah, or Iran, certainly not in a time of great uncertainty. What we ought to be doing is having a genuine conversation with the Syrians, a strategic conversation on a blueprint for future bilateral relations, and doing everything we can to relaunch Israeli-Syrian talks. Finally, one word about Gaza, and Mr. Chairman, you were there, and I think that was absolutely the right thing to do, and I would hope that members of the administration would visit Gaza as well. It is a humanitarian and political catastrophe, both. I don't need to get into the details of the humanitarian situation which you saw firsthand. But politically, it is completely self-defeating. Yes, Hamas is being weakened in Gaza. We have people who work for the International Crisis Group there, and they testify to Hamas's dropping popularity. But Hamas is not going away. It controls Gaza, and the more that the siege remains, the more we're bringing up a generation of Palestinians who are going to be tempted by more radical forms of behavior. The economy is falling in the hands of Hamas because the private sector is being dried up. And who knows if the situation continues whether Hamas will be tempted with a new round of violence which would bring to naught all our efforts on the peace process. So we need a new policy towards Gaza, a more energetic policy that opens it up to normal trade and traffic. It's also in our interest. You were in Doha, Mr. Chairman. You know how Gaza has become the lens through which so many Arabs view U.S. policy. My recommendations obviously entail a long haul, revising our approach towards Israelis, Palestinians, and the region. There are no shortcuts, but I also think we have no choice because our credibility and national interests are at stake. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malley. Dr. Asali.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Lugar, I wish to thank you and the esteemed members of your committee for the privilege of testifying before you. The situation facing Israel, the Palestinians, and all other interested parties, especially the United States, is difficult, but it also presents new opportunities. I'm confident that negotiations will resume soon, with measures in place to maximize the possibility of success. Yesterday's Arab League's decision facilitates Special Envoy Mitchell's efforts to bring the parties together. Proximity talks, regional cooperation, and more constructive rhetoric by the parties will all help. But past experience should temper our expectations for the immediate future. The PA has initiated an important innovation with regard to Middle East peace. The program issued last August by Prime Minister Fayyad under the leadership of President Abbas. Palestinians plan to build the institutional, infrastructural, and economic foundations of their states while under occupation to end the occupation. All parties, including Israel, say it is their intention to realize a two-state solution. The Palestinians are taking up the responsibilities of self-government as they continue to insist on the right of self-determination. In extemporaneous remarks at the Herzliya conference last month, Fayyad explained this, and the Israeli leadership applauded. He addressed accusations of unilateralism by noting that only Palestinians can build up their own state. It must be clearly stated that the Palestinian state can only be established through a negotiated agreement. The Israeli establishment that understands that a peace agreement with the Palestinians is a strategic imperative should recognize this program as a serious pathway to that end, and there should be no doubt about the negative strategic consequences of thwarting it. Institution building is not a substitute for diplomacy. They support each other. The PA innovation is to add bottom-up approach based on palpable achievements to top-down diplomacy. Convergence between these two will result in a mutually reinforcing dynamic towards peace. At the heart of the state-building enterprise are the new Palestinian security forces. The restoration of law and order, increased security cooperation, along with Israel's removal of several checkpoints, has led to an economic upturn in the West Bank. This demonstrates what Palestinians can accomplish and how Israeli concerns can be overcome given appropriate levels of coordination, international aid, technical support, and sustained political engagement. It is vital that Palestinian security forces are allowed access and mobility. Israeli incursions undermine the legitimacy and effectiveness of these forces as state builders. Despite the harsh realities of life under the occupation, conditions have improved under areas under PA control, but significant challenges remain. Last week's tensions were raised by Israel's decisions to add holy sites in the occupied territories to its International Heritage Registry. Continued settlement activity, confrontations in East Jerusalem, excavations near holy sites, evictions of Palestinian families, travel and visa restrictions, belligerent conduct by extremist settlers, and sporadic violence by individual and organized Palestinian extremists all undermine the viability and credibility of negotiators and negotiations. In this context, I acknowledge Prime Minister Netanyahu's intervention to defuse a crisis over building plans in Silwan. The situation in Gaza is dire. Israel's blockade has produced a humanitarian tragedy without weakening Hamas control. Isolation helps Hamas increase its hold on the long-suffering people of Gaza and to create a totalitarian theocracy that systematically takes over civil society and harasses international NGOs, the very organizations best placed to lead the reconstruction effort. In short, the people suffer while Hamas benefits politically from this unconscionable blockade. I strongly recommend that reconstruction commence soon and that legal and orderly operations of the crossings be resumed. I also call for ending the frankly mystifying and counterproductive pattern of Israel's preventing Gaza students from traveling to study abroad. I commend Congress for the substantial aid it provided to the Palestinians last year. This positive trend needs to be expanded by offering the necessary financial and political support for the PA to successfully pursue the state and institution building program. This is not simply a development project, it is a serious political program that advances a key American national interest. I believe that this program should be funded by Congress and that the United States government should lead others to fund and support it as well. I look forward to Special Envoy Mitchell's enlisting necessary partners to achieve coordinated political, economic, and security progress. The United States is the indispensable partner that can bring all parties to negotiations and agreement. And in this, I see the answer to Tom Friedman's suggestion. The United States is the indispensable partner that can neither outsource this issue nor can let anybody else handle it alone. The regional alliances needed to be formed, considering the challenges of this year and next year, can only be dealt with by a coordinated effort through the United States diplomacy. I thank you for the opportunity and look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Dr. Asali. Appreciate it. Mr. Makovsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Lugar, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before this committee this morning. I'd like to just briefly touch upon some of the key points of my written testimony. To date, the Israeli-Palestinian issue has not worked out as the Obama administration had hoped. While the developments on the ground in the West Bank have shown great promise, as we've all agreed upon here this morning, the top-down political negotiations have not only made little progress, but have even regressed. While proximity talks will commence very soon, it can only be effective as a transition to direct talks between the parties themselves or a political cover for those talks, or they are bound to fail. It's impossible for any party or country to make the requisite vital decisions without the confidence of dealing directly with the other side. Is there a role for the United States? Surely. There will come a time for a U.S. bridging proposal, but as you know, you could bridge over a river, you can't bridge over an ocean. Until the parties come close enough, a bridging proposal, it seems to me, by the U.S. will fail. The issue then is where to focus the talks now. I believe the prospects of Israelis and Palestinians reaching a grand agreement on all the core issues is very unlikely at this time. The four core issues are known: the rights of refugees, Jerusalem, security, and territory/borders. The refugees in Jerusalem are narrative issues. Both are tied to the historic connection of the people to this conflict. And in my opinion, both are unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. Leaders have not conditioned the societal landscape for accommodation and breakthrough. We should instead focus these coming talks on what is attainable in our quest for a two-state solution. And the issue where the gap between the parties is narrowest is land, and of course security and land go together. In negotiations between Olmert and Abbas in 2008, 2009, their differences were only over 4.5% of the land. Both said that any land taken by Israel could be swapped for an equal amount of land inside Israel. This narrow percentage difference, coupled with the fact that both parties agreed to the idea of equal land swaps, suggests that the differences regarding land are bridgeable, and I was happy, Chairman Kerry, that you made your comments this morning as you did in Doha. Moreover, a successful deal on borders would be a major victory for all the concerned parties. The Palestinians would obtain 100% of the land they seek through negotiations, undermining Hamas's rejectionist narrative. With a demarcation of the border, the settlement issue would become moot. Therefore, Israelis could annex the majority of the settlers, which live in less than 5% of the land and largely adjacent to Israeli urban areas, and finally resolve their difficult legal status. They've been in a legal limbo for 40 years. For our part in the United States, we would be free of the thorny issue of settlements, disrupting American-Israeli relations, and the idea of a two-state solution would now look to be a reality. Now, what are the challenges to this negotiating strategy on borders/territory/security? The first is the deferral of the issue of Jerusalem. While no border can be complete without dealing with Jerusalem, it is interesting that the Oslo Declaration of Principles of 1993 made clear that Jerusalem was a separate final status issue from territory. If the disposition of the West Bank could be worked out, the city's municipal boundary should be the line until an agreement on Jerusalem is ultimately reached. However, to allay Palestinian concerns about deferring the issue is not tantamount to conceding the issue, there would have to be a baseline agreement now between the parties where it is understood that Jewish and Arab neighborhoods in East Jerusalem will not expand into each other. A second challenge to the borders first approach will be the timetable for implementing it. It would be up to the parties to decide whether they would implement it immediately or wait until an overall agreement is reached. Some would say nothing should be agreed till everything is agreed, but in the Middle East, when it's all or nothing, it often tends to be nothing. Implementation of a territorial agreement before solving all the core issues would cause considerable pain for Israeli leaders, as this would mean they'd have to evacuate tens of thousands of settlers, maybe 60,000 of them, without guaranteeing a final peace treaty. To alleviate this problem, the parties could agree to a non-belligerency agreement, and a statement could be made by both sides in which Israel would accept the idea of a Palestinian state as a homeland for the Palestinian people, and the Palestinians would accept the idea of Israel as a homeland for the Jewish people with equal rights for all its citizens. A third set of challenges are related to security. Much has changed since President Bill Clinton convened the Camp David II summit of 2000. Since then, there's been a Palestinian intifada, a Hamas coup in Gaza, and the introduction of standalone rockets. Furthermore, many Israelis see the Gaza withdrawal in 2005 as triggering thousands of rockets which culminated in the Gaza war of 2008-2009. While Palestinians have been despairing about the enterprise of peacemaking because they see it as producing insufficient results, Israelis have been equally despairing as they increasingly equate withdrawal with vulnerability and not with security. Therefore, the security dimension needs to be handled very carefully. Another set of challenges deals with Iran, and that's regardless of what issue is first on the agenda. It's been mentioned here. I think it's clear if Iran has nuclear weapons, the prospects for Middle East peace are very bleak. Rejectionists will be emboldened, and moderates will be intimidated. A fifth challenge will be the role of the Arab states. You correctly point out the Arab Peace Initiative has been constructive compared to the past, but I think we need to be clear that it is completely backloaded. Just as it would be unacceptable for it to be completely front-loaded for Israel to receive the benefits without paying the price, so too the reverse is not acceptable. Israel can't be asked to give all the land, West Bank, East Jerusalem, Golan Heights before the Arabs do anything. For the Arab Peace Initiative to have reality impact, it must be done in parallel, that Israeli moves to the Palestinians are matched by moves by Arab states towards Israel. It's been stated here about all the economic progress of Prime Minister Fayyad and Lieutenant General Keith Dayton. They've done an excellent job. Indeed, Fayyad's approach of institution building is nothing short of a new paradigm for Palestinian nationalism. His idea of building an accountable, nonviolent movement is the ticket to statehood, is a dramatic departure from Yasser Arafat's sense that of entitlement. The relationship between Fayyad and Israel will be important. Ziad touched on some of the issues of unilateralism. Ultimately, bottom-up cannot be done without top-down. They must go hand in hand. And therefore, to conclude, I would just say, as negotiations begin, direct talks will need to come forward. Time is not on the side of moderates. But if the moderates do not come together, it will not be surprising if extremists exploit the situation for their own benefit. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. Thank you, all of you. We have a good summary of complexity and of hurdles that can always be put in the way. One of the things that strikes me as you listen to all of that, and has struck me for some period of time, is that these hurdles underscore the need to get to final status talk as fast as you can. Would you all agree with that? Dr. Asali, go ahead.
Yes, sir. I think that getting to the final status is crucial and important. The question of timing is a major issue. At the present time, as we speak, with the present political standings of the Israeli and the Palestinian entities, it is hard to see meaningful progress done right away. I think some other things have to be done first.
Let's be more articulate about that, because I understand, and to some degree, I think, Ambassador Kurtzer, your comments about the sort of disappointment of being where we are 20 years ago. I mean, obviously, there's a disappointment. It's almost pre-Madrid in terms of having a proximity talk. On the other hand, because of the Goldstein report and because of the way in which the settlement issue was handled, so publicly hanging President Abbas out to have an expectation that that was the standard, and then going back from it left him weakened. Would you agree with that? And therefore, the reality is you got to find a way to get him back. So I think what happened with the Arab League is a big deal in terms of opening up this process. I think once you've begun that, the sooner you get concrete things happening of one kind or another in the privacy of the talks, the faster those talks can expand. Ambassador Kurtzer?
Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned, while I would like to see success in proximity talks, there's a relationship between the methodology of negotiations and the substance of what's being negotiated. Now, if there are strong terms of reference that have been put before the two sides, then maybe proximity talks can help narrow differences, because it would be impossible to bring them to the table on the basis of very strong terms of reference without such talks. But frankly, I haven't seen any indication of strong terms of reference. Secretary of State Clinton has talked about finding a way to reconcile the views of the two parties. Well, that's the natural action of diplomacy. It's not a strategy. It's not a U.S. policy. Where is it that we say to the parties, we think you ought to be considering X, Y, and Z? A full return to the 1967 lines with swaps, a solution on Jerusalem based on demography outside the old city, and so forth.
If I can interrupt you just for 1 sec to sort of pursue that. I mean, timing is important in those things. If you lay that out publicly, which we could do, I mean, I certainly in Doha said some things that create a framework. I can say them. I'm chairman of this committee. I'm not in the talks, and I'm not the administration and the executive that's responsible for leading those talks. But if you are that entity leading them, and you put it out there yourself as the stated position, it's a big move in the context of all the other perceptions. And if it were to be refused, because in terms of the politics of one side or the other, it's simply unacceptable, you've actually done more damage than good at that point in time.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not persuaded that you do more damage by putting out U.S. views, and I'll explain why. We've been at this
again,
business.
isn't timing important?
Timing is critical, but
know what U.S. views are.
We've been at this business of intermediation now for more than 30 years. And the parties keep turning to us, and yet, in a sense, what we do is try to provide auspices. What we do is set the table. We cater for peace. And I think it's important, both for our own people, but also for the people in the region, for the Israeli public and the Palestinian public, to understand what it is that the United States believes. Now, as I said, I don't see this as an action-forcing event. In other words, this is not a U.S. plan that's take it or leave it. But it gives our diplomats a tremendous amount of material to work. And I wouldn't expect that we would demand from the parties a take it or leave it response, but rather an ongoing set of diplomatic contacts to try to reach some kind of
understanding. Well, I have urged, and I am for putting out what we believe ought to happen at the right moment. I think the right moment is going to be soon. But I do believe that the mistrust on both sides has been, just expanded over the course of the last months to such a degree that the first thing you got to do is get people back to the table to see what room there is to really have that discussion. If you can get to the borders/security issue, I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu was very clear to me. He wants to talk about security. President Abbas was very clear to me. He wants to talk about a bigger picture of what final peace is going to be. So there's a difference in terms of those terms of reference right now. And you've got to kind of get something cooking here that I think we, since we're not brokering in that way at this point, need to encourage that. But I think one can move very quickly to a better term of reference basis on which you are then proceeding. Yes, Mr. Malley.
Mr. Chairman, I mean, you touch on something that I think is very important, which is I was involved in the last grand effort at Camp David. I don't regret it, but there are consequences to failure, and I think we have to be very mindful if we were to now rush, for example, to direct talks, at what would happen if, in fact, those talks were to fail. So I'm not as perturbed by the notion that we're going to go through proximity talks if we use them smartly to probe the parties, to push our ideas, but also to get a sense what is the realistic achievement that we could that's possible, because the worst thing would be to have something that ends in failure. And I also agree in terms of putting ideas on the table. I've been a strong advocate of it over the years. Right now, I think timing is critical. Content matters, context matters just as much. And if we were to put ideas on the table and they were rejected by one or both sides, then good ideas could be discredited and could have been more useful in the future, but discredited now because the timing wasn't right. I think we need to work with the parties. I think we need to work with Arab countries and the international community to make sure that when we put those ideas on the table, we maximize the chances of a positive reception.
There is always the potential that in the privacy of a room where the public forces that sort of pull this apart continually, you may be able to have some much deeper discussions that actually advance things providing you can keep that privacy. And I think that's a concern I heard expressed on both sides. And particularly there are concerns on one party about the other party leaking a lot more, and that then clouds the atmosphere within which they're trying to have a negotiation. I was particularly struck, Dr. Asali, I mean, you mentioned these groups that are out there. If you look back at Oslo, Oslo set out, you do this, we'll do that, then this will happen, and we'll do this. You go that route, and you leave extraordinary opportunity every step of the way for the people who don't want anything to happen to blow it up. And we've learned enough about that now. And that is, I think, a critical reason for why you want to get to the big pieces as privately as you can and get them done. When you get them done, you have stripped those people of their power to pull it apart. Mr. Makovsky?
Yeah, I just wanted to endorse what you said on timing, too, because I think that's crucial, what you said. That, look, if we learned something in 2009 is that there are consequences when America raises expectations. That's why I think, respectfully, Ambassador Kurtzer and I may differ, because I believe we raised expectations too high on settlements, and we couldn't deliver on those expectations. And the net effect was we hurt our relations both with the Israelis and with President Abbas, who said in 2 interviews with the Sharq al-Awsat and Der Spiegel that, left alone, he wouldn't have gone that way. But now he was kind of out on a limb. So I think we got to be very careful when we put forward, an American bridging proposal. Doesn't mean we shouldn't probe, and mediator will be active. I'm sure Senator Mitchell will do that very well. But I think timing is everything, and I think that's one of the lessons of 2009.
Senator Lugar.
Let me just follow through on the themes that have already been sounded in Senator Kerry's questions. I hear you, Ambassador Kurtzer, saying that the importance of stating United States views is really paramount in this. Now, then there's a modification, as I heard Mr. Makovsky and others saying, but it's very important what the views are, and likewise maybe when they are stated, and the thought perhaps that we did state a view on settlements fairly early on, and for a variety of reasons that has not worked out as well as we had hoped. Let me just ask in sort of in a different way. Let's state for the sake of argument that we finally decide as an administration and as a country when the timing is right. Some of you would say, well, you got to sort of prime this to find out when the timing is right. You can't simply observe and say this is about the time, and I understand that. But let's say that we come to some conclusion that the timing is right for the United States to state very strong views. In other words, to adopt a strategy on our part which states essentially how we believe things ought to come out or what the parties ought to do. Now, Ambassador, after we have done that, and that this presumes the timing is right, and it turns out that for a variety of reasons, perhaps fragmentation of authority in Israel or on the Palestinian side, or maybe other events in the Middle East that somehow have arisen and so forth. But in any event, the parties, having heard our views, knowing that we are really now wound up with a strategy that has staying power and is meaningful, and they still do not really come to a conclusion, should we state the consequences if there is not some assent? In other words, having this strategy now, having our prestige as opposed to, not that we've been involved in amateur hour with others trying to do the very best they can, talking a little bit here, talking a bit there, but in a very serious situation, we say this is what needs to happen if we are to be a party to this. And if it doesn't happen, what sort of consequences should we state so that the seriousness of the effort is apparent. Now, having heard the consequences, the parties may still say, this is just too much for us. Politically, we can't get it done. There are other forces that intrude upon us, you don't understand, and so forth. But we say, we do understand. We've been at this for 20 years, 30 years, however long many of you have been at it. And enough is enough. Get on with it. Because the peace of the world depends upon it. Our security depends upon it. Our commitment of armed forces and all the infrastructure depends upon it. This is expensive for us. So it's just not, once again, incidentally one of 5 or 6 things we send envoys to do. We need to get on with it. Now, what are the consequences that we can state?
Senator, when I had the privilege of serving our country as ambassador in both Israel and Egypt, one of the most critical lessons I learned was that when the United States speaks its views, people actually pay attention. Sometimes we indicate what consequences are, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we articulate those views to initiate prolonged periods of diplomatic contact. But the point is that we deal every day not only with governments, but we deal with publics. And until the Israeli public and the Palestinian public and the Arab public generally doesn't understand what it is that the United States stands for in this conflict, I think we do our diplomats a disservice. Now, there's a difference between articulating our views on how the conflict should end and putting them out as a take it or leave it. And I do not advocate the latter. I do not advocate saying that this is a U.S. plan to be imposed. I don't advocate putting it out for a period of time and then withdrawing it or somehow taking our plan and going home, but rather using it as a means for our diplomats to actually work this issue. There are elements of what we would articulate that should have consequences for the failure of the parties to agree, and I would suggest that those be confined to what I would call behavioral issues. Settlements on the one hand, and Palestinian violence and incitement on the other hand. I think on behavioral issues we should make clear to the parties, privately at first, if necessary, publicly, that there are consequences for behaviors that don't contribute to peace. But with respect to substantive issues, our views on Jerusalem or on settlements, these are our views, and it gives our diplomats something to argue and to try to bring the parties closer together.
Mm-hmm. Let me just add anecdotally, because this is far away from this, but at the time of the Ukraine elections in 2004, at the last minute, by that I mean 3 days or so before the second election, President Bush asked me to go to Kyiv and to carry a letter from him to President Kuchma. Now, the letter said, in essence, we want a free and fair election, unlike the one you just did, in essence. And ultimately, there will be consequences if there is not this. President Bush didn't state in his letter what the consequences were going to be. But after I gave this letter and President Kuchma sort of wearily drops it to the side and so forth, I heard fairly quickly within hours from those who were very important to him. And as a result, they invited me to appear on Ukraine television to at least give the American point of view, to do this and that and so forth. Someone even asked me, would the consequences be lack of visas and passports and so forth? And there was an inquiry right away. Now, that was just one situation. It was an election. It was a pointed affair. This has gone on and on and on, all sorts of manifestations. But I'm attracted by your idea that we keep sending envoys. They keep having talks. They keep visiting with various parties, opening up this and that. But in terms of a strategy of our country, enunciated very clearly, and people might say, well, what are the consequences? Well, the consequences might be that you really don't receive our support. For a while, you're on your own. Take it or leave it. Well, people say, well, that's impossible. Our relationship with Israel is something in which you just can't say take it or leave it. Likewise, the Palestinians are important with regard to everybody we're dealing with in the Middle East and have been for 50 years. But at some point, there really has to be a concentration of the mind. Why in the world would the fragmentation of the politics ever change? I mean, there are no imperatives here at all. Why wouldn't intrusion by Syria or Iran always outplay whatever seems to be an indecisive lack of strategy on our part. And so I don't mean to pin you down from your testimony. I'm just saying, in the event we do come forward with this, not necessarily take it or leave it, but the consequences of failure to move ahead have to be evident at some point. Somebody has to worry about this. If they don't, then we're in trouble. We will continue to consult and send folks back and forth and make a profession of this for tens of folks, but really without consequences that we want, I think.
Senator, I couldn't agree more, and that's why I would distinguish between what I think should be consequences for behavioral misdeeds as opposed to policy issues. Mm-hmm. Israel and the Palestinians have every right in the world to hold to their views with respect to territory in Jerusalem, as we will have a right to hold to our views. But there are behaviors that are matters of choice, not matters of necessity, that need to change. And in that respect, any implicit U.S. support for settlements should come to an end. Any means by which American citizens may be funding settlements and getting tax breaks might come to an end. In other words, there are steps that can be contemplated short of the nuclear option, which we wouldn't want to do anyway with our friend Israel. But there are steps that need to be contemplated on behavioral issues as opposed to issues where we differ on policy terms. Now, the one issue that I would fence off in all of this discussion has to do with Israel's security. I think none of the discussions about consequences should touch on that issue. Our strategic and intelligence cooperation with Israel has proved beneficial to both sides and should continue. But those are matters of necessity where I would build a fence on matters of choice that involve bad behaviors. I think there are options before us with respect to those consequences.
Mm-hmm. Well, then in that case, you've stated a policy of Israeli security. So the other side understands the consequence of continuing whatever lack of dialogue there is still going to be the United States that defends Israel, and therefore they'll need to accept that. That is an important factor all by itself. Doesn't fence off Israel from bad behavior, as you're suggesting. But on the other hand, it does perhaps slant the dialogue somewhat, because we haven't said we're going to come to the defense of the Palestinians or necessarily a defense of anybody else who happens to be in this process. Yes, sir.
Senator, I would I agree with some of the points that Dan made on security and behavior. I think the following, though, where I might respectfully disagree with you, is to suggest that if there's not external pressure of some kind, however we define that, it might be walking away, and you could argue, well, if the U.S. makes best faith efforts and it doesn't work, the U.S. will definitely put in less resources in the future. But I think I disagree with the premise that there's no internal drivers for a solution, that if there's no external pressure, it's not going to work. I think what Senator Kerry said about the demographic challenges to Israel, I think the fact that people like Abbas know that if they don't succeed, you have Hamas waiting in the wings. Mm-hmm. Those two challenges alone, I think, are what are going to drive this process. And I frankly think that external pressure could be counterproductive. I mean, it could be natural that after making the best efforts, we just say, well, we can't try as hard because we tried. But I don't respectfully, I don't think I accept the premise.
My time is over, and I'm sorry not to be able to recognize others, but the chairman has asked me to pass things along to Senator Dodd.
Well, thank you, Senator Lugar, and I apologize being a little late getting here. We had a hearing on him in the Labor Committee. In fact, Senator Casey was there briefly on health-related matters, so I apologize not being here at the outset to hear all of your opening comments, and found this exchange, as I always do. Senator Lugar always asks great questions, and I find myself very comfortable with your questions as well as the answers you solicit. Let me ask about the Gaza, if I can, and I don't know who wants to respond to this, but what's our end game here, in a sense? I mean, this seems to me, and again, this goes back, I guess, you're at a different level, I guess, than this question. I'm going to bring you back down to earth in a way here. And given the conditions in the Gaza, and at some point, it seems to me we've got to go beyond what has been the policy right now of just allowing basically, I guess, some foodstuffs in and so forth, but not much more than that. Now, this is the danger of this, because people assume that by saying this, you're somehow endorsing Hamas, which is hardly the case. But the conditions are dreadful, and the reconstruction efforts just don't exist. And I wonder if you might comment on what is going on there, and whether or not how would you assess the political strength of Hamas in Gaza at this point, and how much aid is getting in, what more should be done in your views with regard to the Gaza, because it seems to me this is just a festering situation that needs to be addressed in some way. Yeah.
Well, Senator, I agree with what you said. I think, first of all, what's happening in Gaza is both morally unconscionable and politically self-defeating. And I think I want to focus on the politics, the humanitarian side we all could sympathize with, but I think the politics are what are somewhat get lost. If the notion was to weaken Hamas's hold of in Gaza, I think one thing is clear. We have people who work with us at the International Crisis Group who live in Gaza, and they testify that Hamas's popularity has fallen, and in some cases quite significantly. But to what end? It's not as if there are going to be elections in Gaza anytime soon. It's not as if people are going to rise up to overthrow Hamas. So Hamas's ability to control the situation has, in fact, not only not lessened, it has increased. The blockade has meant that the formal economy has dried up. All of the goods come in through tunnels. Hamas can exact a tax on that. It could control the tunnels. It becomes, as in many cases of sanctions, the sole provider of the people. So Hamas's grip on Gaza has increased, even as its popularity has decreased, but that has no relevance today, unfortunately, because there are no elections or no way to gauge popular support. What's happening is the future of Gaza is being held hostage. The business community is drying up. The civil society is drying up, as Dr. Asali said. And what we're seeing also is a generation of Gazans, 1.5 million Gazans who have known nothing but deprivation, want, and humiliation. I'm not sure that's best for Israel's security in the long term. And there are articles now, and we see it as well on the ground in Gaza, of more radical groups that are challenging Hamas. That's not good for Israel's security either. It seems to me what we need to do is devise a plan, and there are many ideas out there about how you can get normal traffic resumed in Gaza, but make sure that weapons don't get smuggled and make sure that the money doesn't get diverted into the wrong hands. The UN has plans to go that way. Other organizations have developed plans. There are two legitimate or two Israeli counter-arguments. One is security. There you need real monitoring. The other is the fate of Corporal Shalit. Now, we all would like to see a prisoner exchange take place, but I don't see, there's no evidence that over the last years, the fact that we've held Gaza in the situation it is today has led Hamas to be more flexible on the issue of the prisoner exchange. And punishing 1.5 million people because of that issue, I think, is, again, it doesn't stand up to moral scrutiny. It doesn't stand up to political scrutiny either. And I would add one point, which is in terms of our own credibility in the region. This has become one of the filters through which, the prisms through which U.S. policy is viewed in the region. People say if the U.S. can't do anything to lift the siege of Gaza, what good are we? And I think we have to be front and center on this issue, work with the Israelis and the Egyptians to make sure that Gaza could recover as normal a life as possible.
Yeah. Ambassador Kurtzer, do you have any comments on this?
I would add one historical context to everything I agree with that Rob Malley has said, and that is there's no proven experience that imposing this kind of a siege, of a closure, actually affects political views or behavior in Gaza. I had discussions during the course of the Intifada with Prime Minister Sharon all the time on this issue. Something would happen, a terrible terrorist event in Israel, and people would get killed and injured, and the Israeli military would shut Gaza down. And I would then go see the Prime Minister, and we'd have a conversation that basically went as follows. The terrorists did something terrible, and the punishment is now being felt on the part of a population whose views you should want to affect to isolate the terrorists. But by, in fact, isolating the population, you are simply creating solidarity between them. Now, the Prime Minister had a different view. He felt that this was a way to enhance Israeli security. It was a way to put some burdens on the part of the population to pressure the terrorists to not act. It never worked. So I would be extraordinarily sympathetic to Israeli security concerns with respect to any desire on the part of Gazans to export something out of Gaza. That's where security is most directly affected. And I'd be very careful with respect to what besides humanitarian goods go into Gaza so that you don't have dual-use items. But the idea of somehow affecting political views in Gaza by maintaining this tight grip makes no sense, and it has never proved to be correct in the past.
Let me ask you, because something Dr. Malley said here, and that is that at least the appearance, absent an election, that the popularity of Hamas has declined, as has the conditions in the Gaza declined. It seems to me one might draw the conclusion that, in fact, we are having a political impact on what's happening in Gaza. But that's the other two to comment.
Yeah, Hamas has benefited from the blockade, the siege, whatever you call it, and it has benefited politically while the people of Gaza suffer. There is no question that this policy is unsustainable on not just moral and political and human conditions. It's just not sustainable. So we have to divide it into specifics. What can be done? What can be done, one thing is to look at the crossings. The crossings have to be open. The crossings have to be open. The management of the crossings is something that can be worked out between the United Nations, the PA, etc., and the Egyptians and the Israelis to allow goods in, to allow more goods in. And the other thing is the reconstruction business. The reconstruction issue is a very sensitive issue. This is rebuilding after the damage. And this also has been resisted primarily by Israel for a long time, not for security reasons, obviously, alone, for other considerations. This has to be ameliorated. There are other things that can be done to combat Hamas politically. This is, as long as Hamas stands up for the Palestinians, heroic defense against everybody else, it will score political points, even though it has been a political failure as a manager. So that issue in itself has to be open to eventual elections. Elections have to take place at some point in time, and elections start by influencing the hearts and minds of the people. The policies of the United States, in coordination in this particular case with the Palestinians, the Israelis, and the Egyptians, will determine the outcome of the elections whenever that takes place.
Scott, do you want to comment?
Yeah. Thank you, Senator Dodd. Look, I think the question is we all agree that we would like to see some humanitarian approach on Gaza. The question is, how do you craft it in a way that I think your question implied that Hamas doesn't benefit? Because if you look at Khalil Shakaki's polls, that's the Palestine Survey Research polls in Ramallah, and you look at his last 6 polls, what you see is that Hamas is down by 20 percentage points. They spiked up as a sympathy right after the Gaza war in late 2008, 2009. Now they're below where they were before the war. So they're 20 points below Abbas. Everyone likes to say Abbas is weak, but Abbas is running 20 points ahead of Hamas. So, and Gazans say they'd rather live under Fayyad in the West Bank than live under Hamas. So there's something going on here that's interesting. So I just think we have to be very careful. How do we craft this humanitarian approach, which we all favor, in a way that the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank gets the credit? By the way, another factor, a player we have to look at is Egypt. They're the ones building a wall on the Egypt-Gaza border. They're frustrated by their efforts to mediate with Hamas that have failed. So they have to be approached as well. It's not an easy solution, but we have to think creatively of how do you do something in a humanitarian context where it's the PA and Hamas that doesn't accrue the political credit.
Well, thank you. And I'm, I guess, Senator Fish, you're next.
I'm a pass, thank you.
You're pass? I should know the order of arrival, but I'll go to Ted Kaufman. Ted, are you ready? Okay. Okay. And the gavel's yours, Senator Casey. I've got to.
You mentioned that U.S. should get back.
Turn your mic.
U.S. should get back in the diplomacy game. And I was just wondering, how would you characterize? You said some nice things about Senator Mitchell in your testimony. How would you characterize Senator Mitchell's efforts?
Senator, I have a great respect for Senator Mitchell, not only on the basis of his time served here in the Senate, but also his accomplishments diplomatically. I think this past year, however, our diplomatic efforts have fallen well short of the high expectations we all had. I think the President and Senator Mitchell got it right at the outset of the administration when Number one, the President said that the solution of the Middle East conflict is a United States national interest. That's exactly right. Number two, when the President said that he was going to make this one of his foreign policy priorities, none of us would expect that it would be at the top of the agenda, but that it would be on his desk. And third, the appointment of a senior presidential envoy of the stature of Senator Mitchell. But the missteps this past year, the miscalculations, the failure to articulate a clear strategy and then to pursue it, the way in which we created created situations in which we put Palestinians out on a limb on the question of settlements, or even on the question of convening a trilateral meeting in September that had no content and had no results, suggests that we didn't do as well as we might have done. I am not suggesting that we can't do well, and I think that Senator Mitchell certainly has, doesn't need me to say it, certainly has all the capabilities and diplomatic strengths to accomplish this. But I think we need to have a strong policy with which he will operate and an integrated strategy so that we're not pursuing this or that whim and then deciding at the last moment that we don't see it through to a conclusion.
I would assume that Senator Mitchell will be doing exactly what you said. One of the questions that comes up is another issue you raised, which is the public statement of our views on how this peace process should end. I think there's a good reason why we haven't done that for 30 years, because I think, and I'd like your comment on, you say in the comment, you don't want this to become a U.S. plan imposed on the region, but I'll tell you what, as soon as the U.S. announces where they want to go, folks on either end of the spectrum will easily take that and say that's where the U.S. is going when the U.S. is engaged in this, and the U.S. is forcing us. And so I think that's why we haven't done it for 30 years. It would seem to me that Senator Mitchell would be talking to he's talking to parties all the time, that he can surely, I would assume, express to the parties what our position is. What's the advantage of going public with this as opposed to just letting it be in the back in a diplomatic area without making it public?
Senator, let me first deal with the disadvantages of not going public, and we've seen them for the last 20 years. We've had opportunities to move this peace process forward, and in the Clinton administration, and the Bush administration, and now in the Obama administration, we've not been able to exploit those opportunities diplomatically. Now, the interesting thing in this conflict is that most everyone knows approximately how this is going to end.
Right.
Public opinion polls in both communities reveal no surprises.
Right.
So it will not be a surprise if the United States articulates our own views on how this will end and use that as a kind of galvanizing or magnet force to bring the parties closer together.
I think it will galvanize. It'll galvanize the parties. I'm just afraid it's going to everybody knows where we're going. I think publicly saying what we think we ought to do about Jerusalem would be a massive mistake. And I just really, I thought your comments, I agree with so much of what you're saying. I'm just trying to get that out. I mean, just going to the final process and saying where we think it ought to go. I mean, even I don't even want anybody kind of saying that. We want to go through the proximity, kind of work it out, and then we get to the very end, and we all know what the issues are. I'm just trying to, because I respect you so much, what is the advantage of saying to everybody how we would resolve this at this particular point in the process? I guess I'm back to Senator Kerry's comment, too, about timing.
Yeah, Senator, the advantage is based on the disadvantages of not doing it. Take, for example, the situation that Rob Malley mentioned, Camp David II, where the United States did not articulate its views, where we tried to bring the parties together, and only very late in the Clinton administration did the President put out the so-called parameters, which he then took off the table when the parties would not agree to negotiate on their basis. What would have happened had the United States put those views out 6 months earlier? Might it have acted as this magnet to bring the parties together, and might it have had an impact also on public opinion in the two constituencies?
Okay, I think those are very, very good points. What I'd like you to focus on a second, what the impact would be on the region, on the parties, except extreme elements in both Israel and the Palestinian movement of us putting together what we think the final process should be, the final position should be. Just if you could focus on that for a few minutes.
Well, first of all, I think it would stimulate an extraordinary public debate in every society in that region, particularly in Israel, where public debate is a national sport.
Absolutely.
But also in Palestine and in other places as well. That will be a healthy public debate because it will give public opinion and those who articulate views about public opinion, the editorial writers and the think tankers and the commentators, additional grist with which to fuel a very healthy discussion of how their respective societies should move. So number one, it's to fuel a public debate. Number two, it provides our diplomats with a significant, constructive grounding with which to argue our case. I don't doubt at all that Senator Mitchell and anyone else who has been a special envoy in this conflict has talked about final status issues. But without being able to talk about them as a United States position is a sign of weakness and is a handicap to our negotiators. Because the United States should stand for something. We carry weight. We are a major power, and yet our diplomacy sometimes doesn't conduct itself as a major power.
Just one final piece of that. I mean, you have, and Dr. Malley both, have been critical of what the administration has done on settlement policy. That seems to me to be exhibit one of the problems of America stating where it is we're going to go. I mean, stating a settlements policy that doesn't declare, doesn't cause a problem. And I think you'd say public debate in Israel doesn't need fueling. I mean, public debate in Israel right now is vigorous and ongoing. I think what this would do would cut down the debate because they wouldn't be debating the issues. They'd be debating the fact that the United States is now getting involved in this process, and we would become the polarizing agent in the entire discussion. Instead of discussing what's right and what's wrong, the discussion would be the United States says this, they should stay out of here, they shouldn't be doing this, this is not the way to go, but we can kind of agree to disagree. Dr. Malley?
I always hesitate to take issue with what Ambassador Kurtzer said, but I do think I want to sort of go in somewhat in the direction you're saying. The peace process is littered, literally littered with with cases of projects and plans, and from the Rogers plan to the Reagan plan to the roadmap, and on and on and on, that didn't have a positive effect. In fact, just stayed there. And the real, it doesn't make any sense to put something on the table if nothing will happen the day after. The only thing that will happen at that point all those who disagree will come out because they'll have a target, whereas those who agree won't have anything positive to show about it. And one example, although it's not exactly on point, the Geneva Accords, which I think really were done by civil society, Israeli and Palestinian, I think everyone in this room would say this is more or less where it's going to end up. It was put on the table, but it served as a magnet for all the opponents. Now, as I said earlier, I think this is not a matter of the content, it's a matter of the context. And I think there is a time where the U.S. can and should do it, and there I agree entirely with Ambassador Kurtzer, but it has to be at a time when our credibility is restored in the region, where we believe we've done all the groundwork we need to do with Arab and international partners, so that when we put it on the table, the odds of the parties saying yes increase, and the cost for them of saying no decrease. On the settlements issue, you're right. There was no cost for Prime Minister Netanyahu, or very little for him to say no. He got away with it. Our credibility was hurt.
Yes, Mr. Asali. Dr. Asali.
The chances of arriving at an agreement, a final agreement, without the United States being in the mix to the point of having its own views are nil.
I agree.
The question is the timing. I agree with everybody else. Several things need to be done on timing. One, I think the two variables, one for the Palestinians on violence and for the Israelis on settlement, are all true. A third variable, which just been introduced and should really deserve more attention, is what is happening on the ground, relevant to the subject here, truth on the ground. There is a state-building project that is happening on the ground, where the Palestinians and the Israelis have a chance to cooperate and have to be held accountable to the United States in the meantime. This is one way of not testing the final understanding on the comprehensive agreement, but on changing enough facts on the ground where parties can either help or thwart this effort. And I think this would be a measure to guide us to the timing as to where the parties could be more ready. And perhaps they would have more trust in each other by the end of that successful venture.
I'll just say, Senator, I 100% agree with you. As I tried to say before, I think there are real-world consequences we saw in 2009 when we raised expectations of putting forward an American policy without thinking through what are the implications. And we lost on both sides in 2009, and I hope that's a cautionary tale for the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Feingold. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been almost a year since our last hearing on this issue, and while there have been positive developments in that time, there's also been obviously frustration about the pace of progress. I do know that Special Envoy Mitchell has been working tirelessly over the past months, meeting with leaders in the region, and I want to commend him and the administration for these efforts. I believe we need to reflect on the lessons learned over the past year and redouble our efforts to bring the parties back to the table. And obviously, challenges and obstacles remain. Difficult compromises will have to be made, but achieving a lasting peace in the Middle East is essential, not only to the security of Israelis and Palestinians, for others in the region, and, of course, for the national security of the United States. That's why it's imperative that we persevere in our efforts to work with the parties toward a resolution of this conflict. Ambassador Kurtzer, in your testimony, you noted the importance that people-to-people exchanges can have in breaking down differences and building understandings between peoples, even when the governments of their countries may not get along. And so while we continue to push for peace negotiations, what more should be done to build better relationships between the Israeli and Palestinian peoples, and how can the U.S. and other nations help support that?
Thank you, Senator. There are at least two, if not more, very specific activities which the United States can foster to help stimulate and encourage people-to-people activities. One is to revitalize the multilateral negotiations that began after the Madrid Conference in 1991, began to bring people together on issues related to water, environment, economic development, security, and so forth, and then after a few years simply faded away. Now, they didn't accomplish a great deal, but they left a lasting legacy of introducing Israelis and Arabs that goes on today. I travel around the region and still meet with people who remember having participated in such and such a meeting in such and such a location back in 1994. So first of all, we can stimulate the renewal and even more action-oriented multilateral negotiations. I think secondly, we and other external actors can provide seed money, and we're not talking about large amounts of money, but seed money for Track 2 people-to-people activities. There are health initiatives that are wanting for money, in which Palestinians, Israelis, and Arabs are trying to find ways to get together and share ideas about health. Water and the environment are always issues in which you can find professional audiences on both sides that want to get together. We had in the late 1990s or early 2000 period about $10 million of American money to use for Israeli-Palestinian cooperative activities in the NGO sector, and that money was sucked up immediately by very good projects that brought Israelis and Palestinians together outside of government auspices. So there's just a number of things that are not high-cost items that help translate peace into something meaningful on the ground, even while the diplomats argue about things at a different level.
You may not know the answer to this, but with regard to those two examples you gave, do you know if, even if the processes may not have continued, if the interpersonal contacts continued from those kind of talks?
But in some cases they did. In respect to the late 1990s funding, one of our conditions for giving out the funding, in fact, was sustainability. So we were looking for projects that would live beyond the $10 million, and in some cases they did. In the case of the multilaterals, there are some unintended positive consequences. There was not a multilateral negotiation, for example, on health, but a lot of people who watched the multilaterals thought it was a good enough idea that they came together and created, for example, a Middle East Cancer Consortium. There's also a Peace Through Health initiative that's run out of Boston, a couple of doctors in Massachusetts. So this was something that, in fact, was not directly stimulated by us, but was an unintended and positive consequence.
Offshoot of the other things that were done.
I'm sorry?
It was an offshoot of the other things that were done.
Exactly.
Ambassador, you've suggested that President Obama should make the case directly to the Israeli public for U.S. efforts to restart the peace talks, akin to how he reached out to the Muslim publics in his Cairo address. So I'd like to ask you to say a bit more on what steps should be taken to bolster our public diplomacy in the region, starting with Vice President Biden's trip to Israel next week. What do you think his key audience there should be? What are the most important points he needs to make, and will the Israeli public be receptive to it?
Well, Senator, as I've said in the context of the earlier discussion about the substantive U.S. policy, one of the goals that we have to have in our diplomacy is also to affect public opinion. And I think the United States has not done an adequate enough job with Israeli public opinion. They have felt ignored in very concrete terms. And not just because the president went to Cairo and went to Turkey and didn't go to Israel, but also because there has been a relative lack of interviews, of appearances on Israeli television, lack of opportunities for Israelis to kind of touch and feel our leaders. We know from before the last election that there were some doubts in Israel about President Obama's views on Israel. I'm being very blunt, but we know that to be the case. And I think one of the assets that we need to build for our diplomacy is to show the Israeli people that our leaders, both Democrat and Republican, form a consensus with respect to support for Israel, support for its security and well-being, and that this can only be done by, as I say, touching and feeling. In this respect, Vice President Biden's trip and the likelihood of his both appearing on television but also delivering a major speech will be such an opportunity to lay out very clearly for the Israeli people, including from a friend of Israel for 37 more years in his time in the Senate, what it is that this administration stands for and why the people of Israel can trust this administration, even if we articulate views sometimes with which they disagree.
Ambassador, you said that the Syrian-Israeli issues should play a prominent role in our peace process strategy. So in that context, how do you view President Obama's decision to nominate a U.S. ambassador to Damascus, and is there a role for the U.S. to play in the Syria-Israeli negotiations?
Well, I have believed for a long time, Senator, that sending an ambassador to a country is not a favor we do for the country, but it's a national asset for ourselves. It gives us the eyes and ears that we need on the ground. When I served for a short while in our intelligence community, we did a study whose results have been publicized that indicate that a great deal of our intelligence analysis is based on embassy reporting and the embassy contacts that are then reported through diplomatic channels. In other words, our embassies, our ambassadors serve our purposes. They allow us to argue our case before both the Syrian government in this instance and the Syrian public. So I think it's overdue that we're sending an ambassador back, but quite good that we're doing it now. And the designated choice, Robert Ford, is a very good man, and I think he'll do a good job. With respect to the peace process between Israel and Syria, one needs to distinguish between the four substantive issues on the agenda, security, the nature of peace, water, and territory, all of which are resolvable, and what I would call the contextual issues. Syria's relationship with Iran, which should be of great concern to us, its relationship with Hezbollah, which should be of great concern to us. And so it's a far more complicated set of issues than simply resolving the proximate causes of the Israeli-Syrian conflict. But nonetheless, these two sides have also talked to each other on and off for about 20 years, and we certainly should make an effort to see whether we can narrow the substantive differences and perhaps use progress on that to see whether Syria can be weaned, not totally away from its relationship with Iran, which I think is unrealistic, but certainly towards a more balanced position with respect to who it chooses as its friends.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Asali, we've heard a lot of positive comments from you and your fellow witnesses about the work of Prime Minister Fayyad in building up Palestinian institutions, infrastructure, and the economy. What can the U.S. best do to support these kinds of efforts, and do you have any concerns that the building of a de facto Palestinian state could be used by either side as a reason to delay direct negotiations?
Okay. First off, this is, as Prime Minister Fayyad himself said, this has to be a unilateral effort because the Palestinians are the only ones who can build their state. The other thing, the state of Palestine cannot be born without an agreement with Israel. So that has to be clear. In the meantime, we're talking about a process of building institutions and many different levels of state building exercises. For this, and this is the point where I think it is relevant, Israel is the occupying power. Israel has within its power all kinds of tools to make this exercise either go along and happen and mature or frustrated and thwarted. This is one situation where the United States can be very effective in having a meaningful conversation with Israel as we encourage another conversation between the Palestinians and Israel to make this exercise work. There has been an unbelievable amount of cooperation on security. Most of it has gone unnoticed, but it has been real and to the point where I think the Israeli security establishment acknowledges this openly. Now, this has been at a political price for the people who were involved on the Palestinian side. I think the economic progress that has been achieved and the projects that have been done and the initial improvements in the legal and government controls are all things that need to be nurtured and helped by the United States and at least not obstructed by Israel. I think this is where the Congress can continue its generous support for the Palestinian Authority. And I want to mention here the issue of corruption that keeps coming up. The Palestinian Authority has, in fact, gotten high grades by Price Waterhouse for its accountability. All the money that's under the Palestinian Authority is accountable for. So we need to continue the political support, we need to continue the financial support, and we need to continue the policy coordination between the Israelis and the Palestinians on this one.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. I'm going to recognize Senator Casey, but just before I do, can you clarify? There were four. You had water, security.
There were 5 multilateral working.
No. What you said with respect.
Oh, with Syria. I'm sorry.
I thought you were talking about peace with Syria.
Yes. With Syria, there are 4 core issues. One is territory,
right.
The withdrawal of Israel.
Obviously, the territory, and then the water and security. And I missed the fourth. I didn't hear it.
Political relations, normalization.
Political relations. All right. Yeah. Thank you, Senator Casey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I wanted to, in the time that I have, raise maybe 3 or 4 issues. One that I'll start with is the question of talks. What kind of talks can occur in the next couple of months? But I think just by way of a statement of, statement of an opinion that I have is, I think the Israelis have shown, certainly in the last year, that they've been willing to make real concessions. I can't say the same, in my judgment, about the Palestinians. I think there's been a real reluctance or even refusal to really engage in real negotiations. I'll invite people to comment on that. But the two-part question I have is, in light of the fact that there has been face-to-face engagement recently, in the last year or so, if not prior to that, evaluate, if you can, and I'll leave it for the whole panel, the question that some would raise is that, some may assert, I should say, that any kind of proximity talks would be a step backwards. So that's one basic question for the panel to evaluate. Maybe I'll go left to right. And then the second related question is, what can the Obama administration or I should say the Congress do to move that forward, or in particular to put some what I would argue would be appropriate pressure on the Palestinians to come to the negotiation table. Maybe start with Mr. Makovsky.
Thank you, Senator Casey. Look, I think you're correct in pointing out in 2009 you've seen some key moves on the Israeli side. You've seen Prime Minister Netanyahu, for much of his professional life, has been opposed to a Palestinian state, give a speech at Bar-Ilan University where he traversed, I think, a real ideological distance in supporting a Palestinian state. I think that was a key move for him. I think lifting key checkpoints in the West Bank, I think the number went from 42 down to 14. You've seen on the settlement moratorium, while it was qualified, more than any of his predecessors have been willing to do. I think Jimmy Carter got 3 months from Begin. There have been some steps. I don't want to minimize what my friend and colleague Dr. Asali says, which is that on security issues, the Palestinians have been forthcoming. And that's part of the good news that's out there, is the close coordination between Israeli and Palestinian security forces, which is not done in the headlines. I even asked Israeli Defense Minister Barak, who appeared at my institute, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, on Friday, and I said, do you think the tranquility could have happened without close security cooperation? He said, no, that was crucial. So I think that that's where there's been hopeful moves, and the change of a paradigm, which is not a favor to Israel, but a favor to the Palestinians themselves, one of accountability and not one of entitlement. Is proximity talks a step backwards? I mean, technically, yes, it is. It brings us back, as Senator Kerry said, to the pre-Madrid period. But if it's a transition to direct talks or a political cover for a back channel, it's a good thing. If it's an alternative to direct talks, it's going to fail. The parties have to sit directly and deal with their differences. And was there a final point?
About pressure that can be applied by the administration or by Congress?
Well, look, I endorse what my colleague Dr. Asali said about support for Salam Fayyad's government. It's a real change. There was a time where the U.S. Congress could not give any aid to the Palestinian Authority because of corruption. I am concerned, as I try to point out in my testimony, a little rockiness that we're entering a certain period between Fayyad and Israel, which is new. And I think members of the Senate need to be aware of that rockiness because on one hand, he's calling for nonviolent resistance, which is a real change, and I think a positive change, no question. But there have been times where that spilled over into violence, even though that was not intended. So I think anything the Congress could do to encourage Prime Minister Fayyad to work with Israel, not unilaterally, but together, I think that's crucial. But I think, we have to, it's a tribute to the Congress and to its support for Prime Minister Fayyad and to General Dayton that there's been a real change in Congress's approach, and there's a greater sense of confidence, which has translated into better situation on the ground. So I would applaud the Congress, but just keep your eye on the situation.
Doctor? Oh, the microphone.
Right. On the issue of the proximity talks, it's a good start. It's a good start. And I think that there will be a dynamic that will unfold in due time. On the issue of what is happening on the Palestinian side, I think it's important to know there are basically two things: the political management of the issue, and then what you might call the state-building effort. What is of great concern to us is that the state-building effort has been a major success. It's been a cooperative effort between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's been adopted by the U.S., and the Congress has been very generous to support it. And it is very important for this effort not to be penalized by the slowness, by the lack of development, the lack of any meaningful progress that has been taking place on the political front, and that might last for some time. Now, on the issue of the security that my friend David has raised on the security questions about what the Salam Fayyad is doing, he is laboring under an exceptionally difficult set of circumstances where he gets a state security system that he has put together on one doctrine, basically. We are building a state. So if this security system, the security forces are challenged by Israel, by incursions, by events that take place, that puts him in the most incredible position vis-a-vis his own security forces as to, are we collaborating with Israel against ourselves? So that puts him personally in situations where I have personally known about, where he had to go to these places, Nablus, Hebron, etc., after incidents where Palestinians were killed, and then perhaps contain the anger of the people and guide it into a peaceful kind of resistance building program. I think, frankly, he needs to have some slack cut for him, and this is a conversation that we have with the Israelis too about this. This is the only real program that's taking place on the ground now. Let us not jeopardize it by just going to our old thing. There's a perestroika that's taking place now in Palestine, and we hope in Israel too.
I just have about 2 minutes left. I want to make sure that I have an opportunity for our other two witnesses to either comment on this question. I also want to move to, and you can certainly jump to this question about the elections in July 17th, in terms of if, in light of what Hamas will be doing, will you have or it appears that we're going to have voters in Gaza disenfranchised. What does that all mean? Can you comment on the elections, and if you have a moment to respond to the first question?
Thank you, Senator. I think it's important. What you said about Prime Minister Netanyahu's moves is important, and we need to take it into account. But I think to be effective diplomats, we have to see how it's viewed from the other side. The fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu has now endorsed a two-state solution, as Palestinians see it, is not an Israeli concession. It's the Prime Minister's conversion. Israelis have accepted a two-state solution beforehand. This is nothing new, and in fact, Palestinians have accepted the two-state solution, so they don't see what there is to cheer about. And the fact that Israelis are prepared to reduce the pace of settlement growth, they would view it as Israelis doing less of what they shouldn't be doing in the first place under international law. So I don't think that a Palestinian would view the gestures that Prime Minister Netanyahu has taken as significant. I also think, and I said this in my testimony, that President Abbas is the most moderate expression of deep Palestinian disillusionment. In other words, most Palestinians would not want, they think that this whole negotiation enterprise is a charade. He has been, from the first, among the Palestinian leadership to believe in negotiations. I believe he'll be the last to continue believing in them if everyone else loses faith. But he can't be, just as we have to be mindful of Israeli politics, and I emphasize that in my statement, we have to be mindful of Palestinian politics. There's deep disillusionment. If we don't want to lose Abu Mazen, President Abbas, and people always say, let's not lose him, we can't force him to do things that would cost him the credibility that he has with his people. I'm in favor of direct talks, but I think right now to have proximity talks is not the worst we can do. On elections, I don't think there will be elections, because in order to have elections, you need some form of agreement between Fatah and Hamas, which seems quite a ways off, and that's maybe unfortunate. But I think we're not going to see elections this July, probably not this year.
Mr. Ambassador,
Senator, on the second question, I would point out that for more than 20 years, we've asked Palestinians to do three things: build institutions for statehood, build up an economy that assures that it's not a failed state if it ever comes into being, and take responsibility for security. And for the first time this past year, they are doing it rather intensively. The Fayyad plan is indicative of an intention to build up credible institutions. The economy in the West Bank is moving along. I'm sure Senator Kerry saw it on his trip. I saw it a couple of months ago when I was there. And with the assistance of General Dayton, there is now a growing Palestinian security force that is not beholden to a particular political party. It is out to carry out the law and order functions of the Palestinian Authority. So I would probably advise not using the word pressure with respect to Palestinians, but encouragement to keep moving in the direction that they are. I think support that we can provide to Prime Minister Fayyad and to General Dayton to continue building up this capability for statehood is going to be critical, even as we do the negotiations that try to create the state separately. I agree with Rob Malley. I doubt that elections will take place. They certainly will not take place, in my view, before there is reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas, and that seems to be experiencing the usual rocky road. And on the question of proximity talks, I've kind of beat this horse pretty hard today. It all depends, in my view, if there's substance that's going on in the proximity talks. If there is big substance, strong substance, then this may be a way to get them back to the table. If not, then it really is a setback of great magnitude.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Casey. I might just comment that the Fayyad plan is a really detailed, well-articulated, thoughtful document. And to the greater degree we can get that process accelerated, and there's some issues of Area C transformations into Area A's and so forth, which really ought to be accelerated in a good faith effort to build those Palestinian institutions. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your patience this morning. You're almost through. We've talked a lot about the details of what's happening in the Middle East right now. I'd like you to back up and take sort of a broader view. Earlier this year, General Jim Jones, said something like, if there's any one problem that I'd tell the President he should solve, peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians would be it. So you all are experts not only on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also on the greater Middle East. So can you talk a little bit about what General Jones was trying to say with that comment and what the impact of progress on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict might have on the anti-Americanism that we see in some parts of the Middle East and also the anti-Israeli sentiment around the world? And yes, go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Senator. I just wrote a book with my colleague Dennis Ross, who's now in the Obama White House, and we did a few long chapters on that one question. Sometimes it's called linkage. And I think we feel you have to be very careful in how you look at that issue. We have no doubt. The book is called Myths, Illusions, and Peace. I'd be happy to send you one.
Okay.
This
was not a planted question.
Okay,
just
but,
for the.
But thanks for asking. Look, we know that this issue is evocative in the region. And we know that it's exploited by extremists in the region, too. And we see value of taking a card out of the hands of the extremists. But I think we're more humble in believing that somehow if you solve this conflict, and we all want to end this tragedy that's gone on for too long, but I think we also have to be humble in believing that somehow that this is the open sesame move, that somehow if we solve this conflict, as some Arab leaders who come to Washington say, then you've solved the Middle East. I think all Americans have had like a graduate seminar on the Middle East since 9/11 and the Iraq War, and how complicated it is, and all the ethnic differences of Sunni and Shia, and differences between Arabs and Persians, and so many different dimensions. And I think once you know all that, you say, well, good, solve this conflict. It could be helpful for American position in the region, and in a sense, there's an American national security hope that if you do this, it will have some marginal impact. But I think we have to be very humble and not believe it's going to be transformative. Iran will still want a nuclear weapon. Shia and Sunni in Iraq will still have their differences. They're not going to look in television and say, oh, look, the Arabs and Israelis made peace. We can solve the differences between Iraqis and Shia. There's so many conflicts in the Middle East that have emerged that have nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. Will it have a marginal, yeah, it could have a marginal focus, but I don't think it'll be transformative, and I realize I'm saying something that's controversial that will be disputed by a lot of my colleagues, but I don't believe that if we solve this conflict, it'll change the Arab dynamic towards Iran. I was sitting with the head of an Arab intelligence agency the day of Annapolis, the day of Great Hope, and this person ticked off for me all the reasons why the Arabs will not be decisive on the Iranian issue that has nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. So should we pursue it? Of course we should pursue it. Will it have marginal impact in taking a card away? Maybe. But it won't end terrorism. It won't unlock all these other conflicts. But even if it has a marginal role, we know it is evocative, and we should pursue it. And of course we should pursue it because for the peoples themselves that have suffered so long.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. I haven't written a book.
Would you like to disagree, Dr.?
I haven't written a book about it. That's all I can say. But take what I say seriously. I think the problem between Palestine and Israel is essentially the ultimate symbol in world conflicts. Its impact goes way beyond, like Senator Kerry mentioned before, whenever he goes to about Pakistan or to Morocco, people tell him about this issue. It's precisely because of the many layers of symbolism involved: the North, South, the haves and have-nots, the Christians and Jews on the other end, there was the Muslims. It is so many things. I don't want to take your time counting. The reason it is crucial to solve this is not that it will take all the problems away. It won't, of course. None of the other problems will go away. But it will make them subject to a rational conversation. Right now, you cannot really discuss all of these issues, reasonably because of the passion that's surrounded because of this issue. And it is used. And of course it's used. It's used by the worst kinds, and it's used by the best kinds in order to move it to resolution. I have a certain antenna that goes up whenever it says it's not a big deal. Well, it's not a big deal means continuation of the status quo. The status quo happens to be a descending curve. It is not a plateau. And that means across the Middle East, not just between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So we need to change the status quo. And the status quo also means people living under occupation, whose pictures and lifestyle are thrown on Al Jazeera and so many TV stations daily to keep all issues agitated. If anybody does not understand the value of symbolism in politics, then you take away the essence of politics. The other thing is that this is not nuclear physics, honestly. I mean, like, what is it? It's how to do it. It can be done, and it can be done in many ways. And I think we do have now the beginnings of a situation where the Palestinians are taken seriously by Israel and by the United States as having some people who really you can deal with. If we fail to take advantage of that, then we would have ourselves to blame.
Thank you. Dr. Malley or Ambassador Kurtzer, do either of you want to comment?
I don't have much to add to what Dr. Asali said. I recommend that people read David Makovsky and Dennis Ross's book. But that said, I think the argument that solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would resolve all issues in the Middle East is a little bit of a straw man or straw person. Even if we resolved all the problems in the Middle East, you wouldn't have resolved all the problems in the Middle East. The question is whether it would be helpful in a critical way to U.S. interests, given in particular the way in which so many people have used our policy and our efforts and our failed efforts and sometimes our non-efforts diplomatically. Of course, we're going to have to do many other things. The issues have become far more interrelated over the last decade or so, whether it's Syria, whether it's Iran, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's Iraq, and we're going to have to play on several fronts at once. But I don't think that takes away from the fact that this is an issue that resonates probably more widely, not just in the Arab but in the Muslim world, than any other one. And for that reason alone, it's reason to work on it.
Thank you.
Senator, since we're shilling our books, I also wrote one, which we talked about this.
You're going to send me one too?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
But I actually want to quote an Israeli prime minister and a Saudi king on this issue. Prime Minister Rabin, the late Prime Minister Rabin, came to Washington in the summer of 1992 and told President George H.W. Bush that he felt it was imperative to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, not because he was a member of Peace Now, but because he saw the impending threat of Iran. And he understood that the peace process was a heavy weight around the neck of Israel in dealing with this imminent, over-the-horizon threat. About 10 years later, the Saudi Peace Initiative, or the Arab Peace Initiative, was put forward, and the same reasoning obtained in Arab thinking, in the thinking of King Abdullah. Not that there's a linkage between the resolution of one and the resolution of the Iranian issue, but that the lack of resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict represented a dead weight on Arab policy and Arab politics, which was inhibiting their ability to join forces with the United States and others in dealing with a real threat to their security. Now, I agree fully with what my colleagues have said. Linkage is a bad word, and it's been used very loosely in the past in both directions. We had an argument a few years ago that said, don't resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict at all. You fix the problem in Baghdad. That's where the road to Jerusalem runs through. And you've had the other argument made that the road to Baghdad or wherever runs through Jerusalem. It's silly, because the linkage argument is the wrong way to phrase this. The Arab-Israeli conflict needs to be resolved because it's a critical issue for the United States and for the region, and the absence of a resolution hurts our ability to deal with other pressing issues.
Thank you. In the minute that I have left, since you're ending on the Arab perspective, you've talked about Syria, and I think the chairman mentioned the Arab Peace Initiative. Are there other players in the region who are prepared to be constructive, who could be further engaged in what's going on in a way that would be helpful? Dr. Asali?
Yes, I think the newcomer, the last decade at least on the scene, and actively engaged new player is the Turkey. And it has, in fact, made serious attempts to mediate, certainly between the Syrians and the Israelis, and it has been actively coordinating with the region.
Excuse me for interrupting, but I just want to pursue that a little bit because I think there's really been a deterioration of that relationship, and I wonder if you could comment on that and
Yeah.
just a few seconds that I have left.
Turkey's been actively engaged, is what I said, and I think that is exactly how it is. As far as whether people consider this a positive and contribution that we would welcome, or whether it has been an erosion of Turkey's standing with its relation with the West, is an open question in my mind. Okay, I really do think I have personally some trepidations about an engagement of Turkey and on the Middle East that could take away the possibilities of further coordination. And I just want to mention that it has been more protective of Hamas's interest than I would like to see. I think we have enough problems without having Hamas being endorsed by Turkey.
Thank you. Can we take a final comment?
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I would just like to say, Senator, that I think interesting players are actually in Western Europe. You have Gordon Brown in England. You've got Sarkozy in France. You've got Merkel in Germany. And I think taken together, the three of them have shown more balance in the European position than we've seen in the past towards the Arab-Israeli conflict. And as such, I think they've more dealt themselves in, and there might be creative ways to really to bring about a greater role for them in the quartet or elsewhere.
Thank you very much. Yes, Dr. Malley.
Just one word maybe to stand up a little bit more for Turkey's role. I think we would be making a mistake to write them off. I think they're going to have to repair their relations with Israel. That's a critical step they have to take, and Israel, and we could help in that. But they are a country that is Muslim, that is in Europe, that has reached out to virtually all parties in the region, the Israelis, the Syrians, the Iranians, and that's a kind of player I think that we should be working with more closely at a time when the region is as polarized as it is, and at a time when our relations with some of those entities are either very poor or non-existent.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr.
I'd like to just follow one line that has not been explored. At some point, one of you, and forgive me for forgetting which one, indicated that one impelling reason for Israel to consider the two-state solution is that over the course of time, Israel might be a state which is no longer a Jewish state, that there is a change in the demographics that is substantial and therefore threatening to the fact that it would be a Jewish state. Would any one of you explore what the timetable of that might be? What sort of movement is occurring with regard to others coming into Israel? Are they being reflected now in elections or in voting or registration? Or describe what that process might be. Yes, Makovsky.
Yeah, I was the one, Senator Lugar, who I think mentioned demographics as a driver towards resolution. My point was that if you have a situation that Palestinians, West Bank, and Gaza add on to Israeli Arabs, and here you'll get into a demographic debate over what is that point, and it's something to do with projecting birth rates and something to do with looking at the statistics of the Palestine Central Bureau of Statistics. I don't want to get into the weeds on all this, but whether it's 10 years or more, then you may have more Arabs on the ground than you will have Israelis. Now, right now, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza don't vote because the whole idea is to set up a two-state solution. Israeli Arabs do vote. They have full rights. They have representation in the Knesset. They often rail against the Israeli government more than they could probably do in any parliament in the entire Middle East. But the point is that that the demographics is a driver. It isn't yet having an impact on coalition because, for the most part, like I said, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are not citizens. That's why we want to solve this conflict. That's why I think there's an urgency on the border security issue of at least nailing that down and setting up that two-state solution because I think demographics are looming on the horizon. And for the same point, Abbas, if he isn't successful, has got Hamas waiting in the wings, willing to pounce and saying, you haven't produced results. So I think for both of these players, Israelis and Palestinians, there are internal drivers that mean it's critical that these peace talks happen, they make progress, and that we have success.
But what if, just to be a contrarian about this, let's say the Hamas group said by and large, this is really not in the interests of us or those with whom we are allied, whether it be Iranians or elsewhere, for a solution to come. Why, in other words, why it's difficult enough getting Hamas together with other parts of the Palestinian situation, and we all hope that they will come together because that's sort of part of having a state. But let's say they're contrarians. Their objective is really not unification. It's to maintain, really, the antagonism that's involved here. I'm still struck with the difficulties, given the players, as to why you finally get two parties that see some reason to move, and particularly on the Arab-Palestinian side.
I would just, if the question's to me, and I'm sure my colleagues have their own views, I just think that, you could say Hamas could spoil from the outside. I think they could spoil from the inside in any, quote, unity government that they won't allow Abbas to make peace. And so I think where Abbas is strongest is if he could demonstrate that diplomacy is vindicated, that there is something that he could tell his people. Because if you look at those Shikaki polls that we were talking about before of where's the public, 70% perhaps in each camp say they want peace, but they're not convinced the other side wants it. So the Palestinians will say, we're for a two-state solution, but the Israelis don't want it. And the Israelis will say, we're for a two-state solution, but they don't want it. If there was actually something in his hand that he could say, I got it, diplomacy works, I'm a success, they might try to spoil, but at least I think with that middle opinion that could swing both ways, he'll be able to solidify that group and break through that paradigm, which is, oh yeah, we want peace, but you're going to fail because the other side doesn't want it. So I think there's nothing that succeeds like success. It doesn't mean that Hamas won't try to spoil, but Abbas will be in a much stronger position if he has something to point to in his hand.
Yes, Dr. Asali.
I agree with David, actually. I think the success of the moderates in general will determine the future of Hamas and the rejectionist, fundamentalist approach across the Middle East. So we have here more than one variable. It's what the Palestinian leadership wants to do and what it can do. Here again, we call on people to think strategically in the region, specifically on Israel, which as far as we can watch, as closely as we can, it does not take long-term strategic considerations in decisions that it makes today and tomorrow, which it is unfortunate that Hamas is the beneficiary of many policies in the region, including outcome of Israeli decisions, in fact, Palestinian decisions and American decisions, all built on the basis of the failure of the moderates to deliver. We need to have the moderates to deliver. And for this, there is a test now, actually, that I want to come back for the fourth time, perhaps, during this hearing, which is let us make the Fayyad plan in the West Bank a success, a cooperative success between the three main parties, the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the United States, and all the allies. And that would determine the future of Hamas, I think, more than anything else.
Thank you. Well, let me just say on behalf of the chairman and all the members of the committee how much we appreciate your coming today, how forthcoming you have been, as well as obviously well informed by the years. And we thank both of you who are authors so that we can read and we can read more. And those of you who have not published books recently, you've published articles frequently, and so we'll be beneficiary of your wisdom beyond the hearing. Having said so, the hearing is adjourned.